Welcome, everyone. Welcome to your first panel. We have quite a lot of ground to cover even in this first panel. We want to try to figure out some of the mainsprings of this election. Why were the predictions of the pollsters a bit off, to put it generously? What are the key takeaways, especially as the Trump administration begins to put together a transition team, and we also see the developments on Capitol Hill, as well as the state legislatures. I think this panel, probably with only a week behind us, even not, there's a certain humility with which one approaches trying to take in a lot of what happened. At best, this will be the first draft of history, but particularly with a panel of pros like this, I think we'll be able to get an early sense of that first draft. In addition to humility, I'm going to hope for grace and humor, but we'll see how that turns out. I'd like to direct questions, not the same question, to every panelist to move things along, and I'm going to direct my first question to Stephanie, Brian, and Kevin. And I thought what would help with, we have been awash with analysis and data and interpretations. Take a deep breath. You have been commissioned to write the book of this election, all right? The book of the election of 2016. Help us step back and give us the narrative arc of that book, maybe some key chapters, key moments of drama, and you can start the book wherever you think was important to understand the outcome. If you want to pepper it with exciting characters, that's fine too. And extra credit if you give your book a title. So I had a chance to give Kevin a heads up that this was coming. I did not for Stephanie. So I'm going to go first with Kevin as Stephanie absorbs the assignment.
He's got chapters.
And he cheated a bit, but he got here earlier, Stephanie.
That was supposed to look like it was,
clairvoyant.
Off the top of my head.
Yeah, so I'll go Kevin, Stephanie, and then Brian.
Well, I think that first of all, the cover of that book would be like one of those like romance novels featuring like Fabio, but with Trump, with his long flowing hair, Melania looking up at him adoringly. It would be actually kind of. But I actually think a good title for the book would be "What Happened," or Unreal would be the title of the book, because I think so many people who are political professionals who do this day in, day out were really caught off guard and are still asking that question and still trying to explore the dynamics that led to the ultimate result. And to tell you the truth, that is as much as this group is sort of still struggling with a lot of what happened. I think it's one of the great things about politics. It's one of the things I love about it, that every day is a new day, and that you can still be surprised. Who wants to work in a job that becomes routine, or we just rely on nothing but poll data to tell us exactly what's going to happen? So I think it's great that political professionals have to relearn and study and try and figure out some of the trends that are taking place inside politics nowadays. So, but chapter one, I think we have to go back and try to explain this election. Chapter one would be hope is not a strategy. And I think if you look at the ascent of Donald Trump, a lot of it was dependent on how his profile in entering the political arena was initially shaped. And I think many candidates in the Republican primary believed that Donald Trump would self-destruct, that Donald Trump would collapse of his own weight, that he was not a serious candidate, that he'd ultimately never go through with filing papers to actually run. He would never go through the financial disclosures that were required of candidates, that he'd actually never test himself before voters in places like Iowa and New Hampshire, that this was all just a stunt. And as a result, many of the campaigns didn't take him seriously, and they expected that he would fall on his own, or that the media would do the job for them, and that they didn't have to engage. And you saw that time and time again during the primary process. Candidates could have defined Donald Trump in the eyes of voters negatively, decided to stand back and not engage. Which, having been through Republican primaries, 2 Republican primaries before, I found quite stunning, because if that were any other candidate who had come in with such fanfare, all the other campaigns would have spent every second of every single day trying to negatively frame that candidate. And it didn't happen in this one. So I think that was something that was led to Donald Trump being able to build this pipeline of popularity to many Republicans that at that time where there was a great deal of anger and anxiety about the Republican establishment coursing through the Republican electorate. I'd say chapter 2 would be titled "The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend." And one of the things that I think many people underestimated was the capacity or the ability for Hillary Clinton to unify Republicans who were unhappy with Donald Trump. The fact is that anti-Clinton sentiment has been a cottage industry inside the Republican Party for the better part of 25 years. People's belief that Hillary Clinton was not trustworthy, that she was not honest, that she was essentially part of this Clinton Inc. that was bad for the direction of the country, and was representative of everything that Republicans didn't like about Democrats, was very strong. And one of the things that that led me to believe that Donald Trump couldn't win in this election was the fact that data kept coming back and showing that only 75 to 80% of Republicans supported Donald Trump, and there was a very small but vocal contingent inside the Republican Party that said they would never support Donald Trump. But in the end, people did rally to Donald Trump or hold their nose and vote for Donald Trump because they believed he was better than Hillary Clinton, and they, in their mind, believed that Hillary Clinton was the personification of everything that they stood against in policy and politics, which I thought was going to be very hard to do, given that in many ways Donald Trump didn't represent what they believed in either. And then chapter 3 would be people power. I'm always struck by the words of Walter Mondale during his concession speech, where he talked about how quietly the American public wielded its staggering power at the ballot box and sent a message, I think, to Republican Party, Democratic Party, and everybody involved that Washington's priorities had become misplaced. Elites, coastal elites had really become detached from a great population of a great portion of the American population, and that they wanted to send a message that our priorities were misplaced and that they were ultimately the ones, the American people were the ones that wielded the power. And that was something that I think was consistent with what we saw in a lot of the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders and the phenomenon of Donald Trump. That people wanted to send a message about their unhappiness with the status quo, and I think it was something that real anger and that anxiety was something that was not an event, that it's still a process, and that it's not going to be satiated with just Tuesday's results, but instead will be, I think, an ongoing process as we look towards 2017.
Stephanie, have you had time to come up with your blockbuster?
Well, I wouldn't call it a blockbuster. First of all, thank you for having us here. I guess the title of my book would be No Rules. Rules Don't Matter. Because I think what we've learned, we're all veterans up here of campaigns. This is my first presidential campaign that I actually sat out. I have been doing presidential campaigns since 1992. And it was interesting to watch this one from afar, because this was unlike anything any of us have ever seen. And all of the traditional rules, which every 4 years we rethink those rules, we improve on them, we sharpen them. But this year they were all just thrown out the window. What you thought would happen didn't happen. My chapters are according to what those rules normally are. I'll start with the campaigns and the campaign structure. The candidate with the most financing, the better field, get out the vote operation, more data, public opinion, ran more ads by the tens of millions, lost, or at least lost the Electoral College vote. Normally, that doesn't happen. Whoever has the better turnout operation wins. And, we can hear from Brian on exactly what the turnout operation was for Trump, but for all intents and purposes, nobody ever saw any turnout operation. And maybe there was one, and if so, congrats for keeping it so secret. The second rule is media. Lots of talk about how media gave Trump oxygen early in the race, and they did. That's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem is the false equivalency that the media gave to things like nuclear proliferation compared to Hillary's emails, or deporting millions of people to Hillary's emails, or banning Muslims from the United States compared to Hillary's emails. That was false equivalency. Having an email server in your basement doesn't put anybody at risk or violate any of our constitutional principles or freedoms. Yet the media quite often would play every single tiny development in that email controversy. And I'm not making excuses for her having an email server in her basement. That was obviously a huge mistake, and I wish she had said it was a mistake a year and a half ago. But at the same time, those things are not equivalent in terms of the impact on average Americans. The next thing would be data. I think there's a big difference between public opinion research and data analytics. And I worked on both Obama campaigns, and we revolutionized the way people use data. Our data in 2012 was so accurate that we could pinpoint exactly which voters had to turn out, what their likelihood on a scale of 0 to 100 of their support for President Obama, their likelihood of turning out. And we knew exactly where to target our resources, and we were able to predict the outcome of the election months before it occurred. I know that Hillary Clinton also had a state-of-the-art data operation. Something happened. Where they either weren't able to accurately predict how people would vote, or maybe these people weren't being honest with them, or maybe the response rate for people who were uncomfortable with Clinton, but also uncomfortable with stating their support for Trump, weren't being honest, or being responsive to the analytics work. This is a long book. So
it's not longer than Kevin's at this point, don't worry.
Okay, we've got a couple more chapters.
Just tell us what number to expect to be the last chapter.
I wasn't numbering them.
You're on 4.
Okay. The next is risk. For most of the elections that I've been involved in, there are a couple of factors that voters use in determining who to support. A big one is risk. These two candidates were the two most unpopular candidates we've ever seen. Very similar to 2004, you also had two very unpopular candidates, and it came down to, I'm going to dance with the devil that I know. I may not agree with everything, and this is a closing argument that George Bush used in 2004. You may not agree with me or everything that on which I've stood, but exactly, at least you know where I stand. And that framework was thrown out in this election, and it was the exact opposite. I know where these two people stand. I don't care. I want change. And change won over temperament and judgment and fitness and everything else in this election. Next chapter.
5.
Law enforcement. Normally, law enforcement don't enter into the political arena. And many reasons why Donald Trump won, Hillary Clinton lost. I'm not saying this is the predominant reason, but it was a factor. Comey's throwing out FBI protocol to intervene in this race and make a public statement about reopening the investigation into Hillary's emails based on some new evidence that he hadn't even looked at, it did have an impact on the race. It only had an impact on the race because of the preconditions set well beforehand, but it had an impact. I think it suppressed her turnout, and I think it energized his. And, you know, for a race that was won by 107,000 votes, which was the delta in 3 states, and gave the losing candidate the popular vote, those things matter. It matters on the margins. My last chapter is the one rule that held true is that third parties matter. And third parties in this race was the difference, and we don't ultimately know exactly which Jill Stein votes would have gone to Hillary if it were a two-way race, or even some of Gary Johnson's votes. But we do know that the difference from which she lost in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania was a very small percentage of the vote that those two third-party candidates got. Just looking at how that vote shifted over the course of the campaign, many of those Jill Stein voters and Gary Johnson voters were Hillary Clinton voters. They never came home to her. Many of Trump's voters did come home to him in the end. So third parties absolutely impacted the results of this election. The end.
Thank you. Well done. So we have Kevin's book entitled The Improbable Candidate. We have Stephanie's Rules Don't Matter, except the one, third parties wound up mattering, interesting, and something I don't think has been much focus on. And now to Brian.
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me here. It's a great honor, and it's also a real honor and a pleasure to be sitting here with Joel and Stephanie, two absolute professionals who've elected a president, and with my colleague Kevin and Jonathan, so it's a real honor. My book's going to have a slightly more personal title, and it's From 100 to 100. And that, God bless you, will be confusing to most of you because while my bio indicates my title and my role, it doesn't tell you how I'm in this job. I actually work for the family that founded TD Ameritrade and owned the Chicago Cubs, the Ricketts family from Nebraska, and have worked for them for 7.5 years. 4 years ago, the Chicago Cubs lost 100 games, and Mitt Romney lost. And this year, the Cubs won 100 games and the World Series, and of course, the Republican nominee for president won. I'm not sure which is more improbable, the Cubs winning the World Series or the Republican nominee for president winning Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But so the title is From 100 to 100. My first chapter is again personal, and it's a little bit of a historical fact, but 23 years ago, I was a student like you all, but I studied in Rome at Loyola University's Rome Center, visited Florence often. But something else happened 23 years ago. Actually, this week, November 17th, 23 years ago, the House of Representatives passed by a very bare majority NAFTA. Now, I happen to be a free trader. I'm not sure I knew exactly what that meant when I was in college studying in Rome. But I think if you're going to start the story of this election and you're going to talk about how we won Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, I think it's important to start at 23 years ago with NAFTA. So that would be chapter 1. Chapter 2 is playing off of exactly what Kevin talked about and the role of the media. The media's examination of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was nothing short of fascinating. I totally agree with Stephanie when she talks about the equivalency that was given things like the server in the basement or the bathroom, whichever it was, and things like Trump's comments and so forth. But I think people take the wrong lesson from that. I think that people became comfortable with Donald Trump. And one of the things that I underestimated during the Republican primaries was the way in which people had actually grown comfortable with Trump over his many years in the media. And right, he'd been in everybody's living rooms. He'd been on the wrestling show. He'd been on The Apprentice. So people grew comfortable with Trump. In the same way, they never became comfortable with Secretary Clinton. It was remarkable how people really loved Bill Clinton, but couldn't ever wrap their arms around Secretary Clinton. And I still to this day don't understand it. Maybe there were ways that she could have been humanized, I don't know. But Trump was, in a very real way, human to people. And I think people, rightly or wrongly, despite the billions that he has or doesn't have, were familiar with him and comfortable with him. And so that I really credit the media, but not necessarily the news media, but the role of just TV in general and how that it interacts with voters. Third is data. Stephanie talked a little bit about that. And of course, what the Obama campaign did in 2004 with data was just really nothing short of remarkable. 2008, excuse me. I think that the story of Republican data hasn't really fully been written and understood in this election, but I can tell you from the Republican point of view, we did everything we could to learn from what Stephanie and Joel and their colleagues did in the Obama campaign, and undoubtedly that played a role in the successful election of Trump, Pence, and re-electing a Republican majority in the Senate and the House. I'll tell you that earlier in the year, when it looked like we were going to be getting involved to help Mr. Trump from the outside, we created something called the reluctant Republican model. Kevin talked about the fact that early polls showed only about 80% of Republican voters wanted to support Trump, and that really would have led to his defeat. So our entire goal and project was to convince reluctant Republicans to turn out, and that was 100%, or maybe 98% of our focus. And the other small percent was on what we called soft Democrats. We were struck by the number of folks in focus groups and in the survey data that, for whatever reason, could not be convinced to vote for Secretary Clinton even though they were Democrats. So some amount of our resources went to targeting soft Democrats. On the hidden GOTV or get out the vote operation that Stephanie alluded to, I always wondered during the campaign, where is it? Because while we were certainly doing some of that from the outside, from an independent effort, we were told, and all publicly through the press, that the Republican National Committee was doing that. And in fact, it appears that they did. Reince Priebus, the new White House Chief of Staff, obviously led a tremendous effort. Unbelievable amount of people that they hired, number of offices they had, because if without the RNC, I don't think Trump would have been elected president. They set up field offices in all the key states. So really, the get out the vote operation wasn't a campaign thing, it was a party function. Chapter 4, if I think I'm at 4.
Yes.
Is what I call the beer test. And I'll be really curious for Joel's opinions and impressions on this, but I think sometimes the election for the presidency can just boil down to who would you rather have a beer with. Personally, for me, even though he doesn't drink, it would be Donald Trump. I can say in 12, it was probably, though I loved him and worked for him, it was probably also President Obama and not Governor Romney. Certainly, I worked for Bob Dole, and I think most people would agree Bill Clinton would be a better drinking companion. So, and maybe Stephanie, you'll agree that George W. Bush might be more interesting than John Kerry, I don't know. So it might be that the role of the presidency and the race for the presidency, despite all the hard work of everybody up here and a $2 billion spent, just comes down to beer. Chapter 5, I want to respond to what Stephanie said about law enforcement, but actually I would call my chapter Law and Order. And not law enforcement. I can't tell what impact Director Comey's actions had on the election. I would disagree. I don't think he acted inappropriately. I think he did what he thought was right. This is a man who stood up to President Bush, even though he was his nominee and his appointee as Deputy Attorney General. So I think Director Comey has a long record of public service that should be respected. But I say law and order for my chapter because in the primaries, when we were working hard to get somebody else nominated, every time there was a terrorist attack, I think Paris, San Bernardino, there were several others. San Bernardino definitely stands out. Trump's numbers went through the roof. Trump won even bigger margins because people are afraid. There was a I guess, a mini riot or something in Chicago right before the Florida and Illinois primaries. Now we understand it might have been orchestrated by others, but nevertheless, that I think definitely helped Trump and his numbers. So I would say law and order was probably a reason for the win. And then finally, I would just end with, Stephanie said it was 107,000 people, and I know that Democrats and Clinton supporters are still wishing they could find those 107,000 people, and I don't think there's anything that will make that sting go away. Kevin and I, the number I think is 237,000. That's the number that Mitt Romney was missing in a few states 4 years ago. So it does come down, every vote matters, and that's the importance of programs like this at NYU, is to make sure everybody gets involved in the process. So thank you.
Great, great. Thank you, authors. Well done. A lot of talk about data, which seems a perfect pivot to Jonathan and Joel. Joel living it day by day. Jonathan, part of a newspaper operation that was obviously conveying a lot of this to the public. I work at a university where now there's tremendous investment in things called big data, data science, informatics. We seem to be living in an age with ever increasingly sophisticated tools to amass and assess data. And yet, we come upon an election where the number crunchers, whether they were sitting in electoral map rooms or pollsters or my computer scientists at NYU, all seem to be off the mark, and by quite a bit. So why don't I turn to Joel and then Jonathan of sort of what went wrong or did more go right than we think, and what's the future of polling to try to close that gap for the future.
Look, I think first of all, people have to understand we're conflating things when we talk about data in terms of what I call custom data or small data polling, custom polling, as opposed to data analytics and probability forecasting. The commercial world is obsessed with big data as well. Marketers are using it. That's very backward-looking data. It tends to be based on behavioral metrics, what you can identify about people from the past, and it provides very little in the way of diagnostics about what they will do in the future or why they're doing it. Now, you can do a lot of statistical analysis and come up with correlations, but I believe the sweet spot is really trying to figure out the intersection of big data and small data. I think you have to understand what's really happening in real time with people in terms of their attitudes, their values, the issues that they're confronting. With all due respect to our impromptu authors here, I think one thing that's apparent, and I think that it's not going to change anytime soon, is that there are going to be many more theories than answers about what happened in this election. If you look inside the exit polls, there are many confounding things, and I don't think they all give perfect answers either. I do believe Mr. Comey did, both 11 days out and 3 days out, did have an impact on the election, and it was unprecedented, and he was criticized by both Republican and law enforcement officials for violating what was longstanding FBI protocol. That being said, I think that, forget the number of votes across states, I think when you look at the third-party vote, what we always saw during this election was there were people in the two-way horse race who became defectors when you went to a four-way horse race. So we always had a group of people who were Trump defectors and a group of people who were Clinton defectors. And at various points as we headed out of the third debate, it looked like first Trump's defectors had come home before ours did, and these people are, as Brian and Kevin talking about, were more Republicans. And then our defectors started to come home until that Friday. And once that Friday hit, we saw our defectors go back to the third-party candidates. And while we can talk about how few the margins were, but in these states, in particular, some of the large states, it was quite significant. In Florida, a state that Hillary lost by 120,000 votes, the third-party candidates comprised 270,000 votes. Now, why do we know that there are defectors? Because the clearest delineation of defectors was age. And people under the age of 45 in this election nationally, 8% of them voted for the third-party candidate. People over the age of 45, it was 2.5%. So, and that pattern holds up when you look across the states. The same is definitely true in Wisconsin, for example. We lost that state right now by 27,000 votes. Jill Stein alone, the weaker of the two third-party candidates, had 31,000 votes in Wisconsin, and she's a liberal. Liberals voted for Jill Stein. So I think there are so many variables here that you could look at. You know, Republicans at first were talking about a surge of rural working class voters. Well, it turns out that in fact white non-college voters went down as a percentage of electorate from 2012. So that theory didn't hold up. Somebody, I don't remember if it was Kevin or Brian, mentioned NAFTA. Well, if you look at exit polls, a plurality of Americans actually think the trade either creates more jobs or has no impact on jobs in America. It's about 49%, and only 42% think that it loses jobs. Look, I think that what we've seen here, the closest thing in the short term that I think you can find to explain something that seems quite aberrational, there are two things. But first of all, we've been going through a period, and we've had this discussion, I think, at previous sessions here. You know, the trust in any institution in America has gone way down, post-crisis in particular. It's led to a strain of economic populism. It's led to a strain of antipathy towards any institution. And so for Donald Trump, who was a quintessential outsider, that was an advantage and the strength of the hand he was playing. And that anger and frustration that I think Ambassador Phillips described in Peter Hart's memo is probably part of it is frustration with every institution. And if you feel that none of these institutions are working, then what the hell, I may as well vote for someone who will just blow the whole thing up. And we'll see how much buyer's remorse there'll be in the short term, possibly. But I think it poses challenges for data. And one last point on the media and probability forecasting. I got an email from a journalist the other day asking me about data journalism. And we've talked about turnout, and we've talked about, you know, whether any particular event Comey depressed turnout. But a lot of the coverage and the obsession with Nate Silver and 538 and the upshot focuses on who's going to win, what's the probability they're going to win. And I think when we have people talking about there's a 93% probability that Hillary's going to win, you don't feel that the election is at stake as much as you do when you hear Hillary leads by 2 points in the polls. There's a very big difference in going out to vote when you think there's only a 2-point difference, but then there are these scions and geniuses who tell you it's of near certainty that she's going to win. And I think that adds a whole other issue for the media as they think about this. Way too much attention on that kind of data instead of what's really going on beneath the surface with voters.
So
and
Jonathan,
the title of my book would be Wake Me When It's Over.
Right, we'll get to have it. So Jonathan, a challenge to you, because certainly the media have become, the major newspapers and outlets, a way of moving this data out with their probabilities, perhaps not fully explaining to a lay audience what a probability means.
Well, I'm going to frustrate you and the audience simply because in order to understand what I'm going to say or not say, you have to understand my role at the newspaper. I'm not in the front of the paper. I am not in the news section. I do not work with Marty Barron, our executive editor. I'm on the editorial board. So we are there in our ivory tower looking at things from 35,000 feet and having the luxury and actually the privilege of being able to say exactly what we think about what's happening. So when it comes to polls and what newspapers or media outlets do with them, I have no role in any of that except as a consumer. And like everyone else, those of us on the Washington Post editorial board were completely floored by what happened because we're looking at the polls, we're looking at 538 and the fix and the upshot and all of these outfits. I just found them completely maddening for the very reason Joel talked about. Everyone's obsessing over what's Nate Silver saying about the probability or what's the New York Times scale in the morning. I was guilty of it. I would look every morning to see what's the percentage, 90% to 10%. When it went down to 75%, I thought, oh my God, and then it went back up again. Because we were all focused on that, we weren't focusing enough attention on what actually was being said. And so I'm going to focus a little bit of my time on just the media. And we have a great reporter at the Washington Post named David Fahrenthold, who spent enormous amounts of time digging into one aspect of Donald Trump's story, and that is his philanthropy. He's a great philanthropist. He's given away millions of dollars to this, that, and the other organization. And yet, after more than a year and a half worth of digging and reporting, he could not find one major recipient. He did give some money away. He did use some of the foundation's money to buy a portrait of himself and I believe a helmet. I can't remember the football player. But that's just one of many stories that news organizations ran that got no attention. And that's because, and correct me if I'm wrong, all the people who here are more expert in this, the people who support Donald Trump during the primaries, during the general election, didn't care about any of the stories that were out there, not the Russian connections, not the foundation stories, not how he ran his businesses, not the bankruptcies, not the allegations of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, not the Billy Bush audio that stunned the nation. None of that mattered. One of the most important interviews I think I did during this entire election campaign was with Omarosa. I don't need to say her last name, we all know who she is. I was substituting for Steve Kornacki on his show, and we were trying to figure out who could we have on the show who could talk about the debate, because it was going to be Donald Trump's first debate. It was August of 2015, and one of the producers said, let's bring on Omarosa. And I thought, that's perfect, because one, Donald Trump will do something that will have us talking, and two, she could be our Trump whisperer. She could explain to us what's happening. The key observation she made was, one, reality television has taken over America. Everyone watches reality television. Two, Donald Trump, and this gets to, I think it was either Kevin or Brian who said this. Two, Donald Trump is a king of reality television. He's been in people's homes for years, about more than a decade. And so when you take a reality television star and put him in the presidential arena, all the rules are thrown out the window. And she said, if that means he's going to call someone a fat pig, well, that you just have to take that, because you can't. There are no rules. I believe that's Stephanie's one of Stephanie's chapters. And so what ended up happening was, despite all of these things that happened, despite everything that he said, all of the unconstitutional and immoral proposals that Donald Trump put out there, he still got elected. And I think in addition to the media not paying attention to what he was doing in any substantive way, or at least giving the substantive stories that were being reported any airtime, Donald Trump was being given unfettered airtime. And he did something that I think, as a journalist, ultimately is a good thing, 51-49, and that is he would pick up the phone and call into shows. A presidential candidate would pick up the phone and call into a show and say exactly what he thought about something. Now, the downside to that is when someone's on the phone, you don't know who's there. You don't know if that person's being handed notes, being handed talking points, being told steer away, move on to something else. When the candidate is sitting there...
I'm pretty sure nobody was handing him any notes, Jonathan.
I'm almost certain you are right. But when the person is sitting face to face, it's much more difficult for the candidate to get away with things, especially if the reporter is on his or her game and paying attention and listening. So that's the one thing I will give Donald Trump in terms of changing the game, is that he has now given an expectation that candidates will be much more accessible. I believe it was Peter Thiel, and somebody, correct me if I'm wrong, who I think gave the most apt observation why what happened. And he said, the media took him literally and not seriously, and people took him seriously and not literally. And when you think of it that way, that explains why he could say what he said, propose what he proposes, and get away with it. And still, despite everything we were taught, let me speak for myself. Despite everything I was taught as a child about what it means to be an American, what it means to be in public service, what it means to be President of the United States, how we hold our presidents as a better version of ourselves, that's how all of that has been thrown into question and basically thrown out the window with the election of Donald Trump. I know that doesn't answer your question, but I feel purged.
Proper accreditation that should go to Brad Todd, who actually came.
Brian Todd, okay, thanks.
Brad Todd.
We're all enshrining that. No, I mean, there's data, Jonathan, and the numbers, and then there's the other kind of data, which is actually going out and listening to people and trying to determine what you hear and investigate stories. So I think it all falls under the data umbrella. So we have had an election, and it also affected the House and the Senate. So for the first time, I think since 2006, we have one-party control, White House and the legislative branch. I want to ask Kevin and Brian and Joel, what do we think is going to happen with this relationship with Republicans in control? Are they really one party? We call it one-party control, but what are they going to be going through? I'll let other people jump into, of course, but what are the Democrats going to do in the minority? Any prospect for legislative achievements over the next, let's say, 2 years? Why don't we leave it at that? But what can we expect going on in the interaction between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue? Stephanie, you want to take? Kevin?
Sure. Look, I think it goes without saying, and it'd be an understatement to say that Donald Trump doesn't really care about ideas or issues. He is not motivated by policy. And what he does better than anything and what his focus is selling. He's a salesman. I think if you were to break the Republican Party, or if you were to look at the Republican Party as a business, research and development around ideas and issues and a policy agenda is going to be outsourced to congressional Republicans. And I think the key dynamic there will be Vice President Pence and his relationship with Paul Ryan, who is the ideas engineer of the Republican Party. So when you look at what could potentially emerge as an agenda, I think you'd look to Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan, and his Better Way agenda, which they worked very hard on. They believe, and that was part of, I think, Paul Ryan, who I think agonized over supporting Donald Trump, genuinely agonized over it. I think one of the reasons that it came down to a binary choice for him. It was who would sign my Better Way agenda into law, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? Well, it's Donald Trump, so therefore I have to support him. And that strong relationship with Mike Pence and an understanding that Mike Pence will play a big role in a Trump administration. I think that was key. So I think that's the R&D part of the Republican Party, and the sales part of it is going to be Donald Trump. And a lot of the Republican agenda that you have up there, whether it's healthcare, energy, maybe even things like tax reform, infrastructure. One of the big obstacles to getting some of those things done was an ability to sell it to or to convince working class Americans that it was that it was going to benefit them. And Donald Trump has a unique ability to do that, and has demonstrated that with the level of support that he received from some pockets of the country. It'll be interesting to see how long congressional Republicans sort of stand by Donald Trump as his popularity either increases or wanes. Because at the end of the day, they're all self-interested. They all care about their relationship with their voters back home.
Lost order of who I'm asking, so we'll let anyone weigh in. And we were told we can go to 12:30 for this panel, but I want to leave 15 minutes or so for questions. So, Brian, why don't you?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with everything Kevin said, and certainly the speaker's agenda is one of the great reasons why we supported Trump and why many others stepped forward. I started chapter 1 of my book with NAFTA, And I know some people disagreed, and Joel, you have data which disproves me. However, one of the big issues I think that was in the Democratic primary, and I think occurred in the general, was TPP, which a trade deal. And of course, I think Secretary Clinton was for it and then against it because she had to deal with the Sanders issues. And Trump is very much against it. They say, I think the Washington Post said that his first act as president would be to walk away from that. But Paul Ryan is for it. So I think on some of the issues that you'll have with the Trump administration and Congress, there'll be 100% alignment, like dealing with the deficit and debt, taxes, Obamacare. But on some of the issues that were core to Trump's message, populist message like trade, you'll have some differences, and I'm not sure yet how those will be resolved. And the reason why I think that trade was so important is because, details aside, Trump used trade as a way of demonstrating to everyday Americans that maybe have not seen real economic growth or real wage growth, many of whom are unemployed or underemployed, who, despite President Obama's record over the last 8 years, still feel totally left out. And many of those folks are in that upper Midwest region that shocked the world last Tuesday. So I feel like trade is a very, very significant part of it, and Trump used that as a way of showing these people that he'll fight for them. And I think that was very much to Secretary Clinton's detriment.
Other thoughts on either what to look for in the next 100 days as a precursor, or predictions on what kind of legislative initiatives might be forthcoming?
Well, I think it's going to be completely unpredictable because you have a president who is, first of all, completely unpredictable. And I think that, and I'm saying this not to be critical, but is probably the most unprepared president we've had in the 20th century for what he's about to undertake. That's not just my view, by the way. Even 1 out of 5 of his own voters believe he's not qualified to be president. And I think that is daunting for all of us. I think, to Kevin's point about having someone like Paul Ryan, who is an ideas person and has an agenda, is going to be interesting. But I think it's going to be difficult when you get somebody like the Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, saying to Democrats, well, if you want to get things done, you have to work with the other side, when he, in the first months of the Obama administration, said our goal is to make him a one-term president. I think he's got not a lot of standing and credibility as an appeal for bipartisanship and a lot of cooperation there. Now, that doesn't mean that Democrats will walk away from it completely. But boy, I think there's a lot of pressure on Republicans to show something different than they've shown in the last 8 years. And I don't think the Democrats are going to lay down because we got a president who was elected, in my view, without a mandate. To be quite honest with you, I think that we have some challenges, and I know I'm getting off the topic of policy here, but the reality is he did lose the popular vote. Right now it's at about 600,000. On a broader issue for us as a country, it's the second time this century out of 5 elections that we've had a president elected without the popular vote. And I think at some point, when Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders talk about the system being rigged, it's not just economic, it's political. And I think we have to look at an potentially outdated institution like the Electoral College. I was curious after we had a discussion last night about a lot of stuff, and I went back and I looked at it. If you're in California right now, they get 1 electoral vote for every 600,000 people. If you're in Alaska, Wyoming, or Montana, they get 1 electoral vote for every 200,000 people. At some point we're going to have a bigger clash over this than we are right now, because that's not going to be helpful for our democracy either. To have the majority of people feel like they have lost their franchise in a process that was designed 240 years ago to protect the southern states and slaveholding states, when in a modern democracy and a vibrant country with over 300 million people, we're electing presidents now on almost half the time, 40%, without winning the popular vote, which was almost unprecedented before that. So I think that, this isn't going to be all kumbaya and let's all get along. And I think there's going to be enormous pressure on the president-elect when he starts out. He doesn't have to do a State of the Union speech in your first year. But I think there's going to be enormous pressure on him to perform at a level that Americans expect of the President of the United States. And to be quite honest, I don't think we've seen that during his campaign. I think we've seen a lot of things that are kind of risky and scary to people, and I think he's going to have to figure out, and I don't know that people can change that much when they're 70, how does he lead not only this country in what is a pretty divided country politically and legislatively, but how does he serve as the leader of the free world, which will hang on every word? I mean, there was probably everyone on this stage, not just Democrats. I mean, you work for the Ricketts family. He threatened the Ricketts family when they were running ads against him. I mean, he's going to have to find a level of self-control and poise that gives us any hope of getting anything done, or no one is going to follow him.
I hope this isn't even more off topic, but jumping off of what Joel was talking about in terms of working with leaders on Capitol Hill, Republican leaders, the one thing that I found probably most distressing now that Donald Trump has been elected is not Reince Priebus as White House Chief of Staff, but Steve Bannon as a senior advisor to the president, given his history. And what kind of signal does that send to the country about how serious President-elect Trump is about unifying the country? I mean, Steve Bannon runs Breitbart News, which has become a home for the so-called alt-right movement, but I will drop the euphemism and call it white supremacy. And so now we have someone in the upper reaches of power who will be advising a president of the United States. And if anyone thinks that I'm just being hyperbolic here, just consider for a moment what the reaction would have been if President-elect Obama in 2009 had announced that Reverend Jeremiah Wright would be a senior advisor to the President of the United States, and let that settle in.
I'm sorry, I feel obliged to respond. Steve Bannon is a friend of mine. He is not a white supremacist. He is a great man. You might disagree with his tactics, and people can question them, but he served his country in the U.S. Navy. He was a senior banker at Goldman Sachs. He is incredibly talented. He is a good manager. He's a good friend of mine, and Donald Trump is lucky to have him.
I think the main thing I'd question is on that, though, is how many people even know who Steve Bannon is? I think
well, the people sitting up here do, Kevin.
I know that. My thing is, I'm just talking about the public perception on that. I just don't think many people identify who that is. It's just a reality.
Well, can I share with everybody just one thing, if I may? So if you don't know who he is, because he disagreed with a Republican conservative named William Kristol, his website referred to him as a renegade Jew. That's who he is.
Stephanie, why don't you have the last word on this, and then we'll open it to questions.
I think to Joel's point about Steve Bannon, it's not whether or not he has name recognition, it's what he represents. And I think it's going to prove to be problematic, not just for Democrats that he's in there, but it's going to prove to be problematic for Republicans. Because what Steve Bannon represents really doesn't speak to the totality of the Republican Party. But he, in that role, I mean, let's remember, just 24 hours ago, Trump announced Bannon and Priebus, Bannon as senior counselor, Priebus as chief of staff, but put Bannon first on the list. And that was a sign that he was trying to send to the alt-right movement, many of whom helped orchestrate Trump's victory. And I think Bannon's influence on the agenda and the communications and the outreach and the overall strategy of the White House will prove to be a problem for the Republican Party.
Well, probably interesting to see in the Bannon-Priebus what kind of relationship that is and who dominates over time. So maybe that's something for us to keep a watch on. So let's open it up for questions right here, and then please identify yourself just so we know, and sort of, I can tell you're a student here at La Pietra, Dale, so why don't you start? As in, what do we think is going to happen next?
What their position's going to be, and maybe what's going to happen.
Good.
I think that's a great question. It's a good point. So many issues in this election, but immigration certainly predominated. And I think my position on Steve Bannon is clear, but to key off of what Stephanie said, that his role as senior counselor to the president is a sign that immigration is going to be an issue. Steve has really led the charge on immigration reform, although that term was more euphemistic for the Gang of Eight bill or more of an open borders approach. Steve's approach is that we ought to know who's in the country and that we ought to have an orderly process for letting folks in the country and that we ought to secure our borders. I don't think that that's a crazy viewpoint. People may try to portray President-elect Trump or Steve Bannon or people who feel that way as out of the mainstream, but it turns out it actually is mainstream. Immigration certainly dominated in the Republican primaries. The most conservative viewpoint on immigration won. The person who held that view won the Republican nomination and won the presidency. Joel says there's not a mandate, and certainly the Electoral College versus the popular vote, demonstrates there is a 50-50 divide in the country. But on immigration, I think you're going to see immediate action by the Congress to secure the borders. And I think, Trump will have wide popular support in that. And if Steve Bannon gets that done as senior counselor, I think Trump will have a successful presidency. Why don't I not talk about the 11 million, but why don't we talk about a subset of the 11 million, and those are the people who are here illegally, who are also doing illegal things. And I think that's where you'll see the Trump administration move first, are illegal immigrants who commit crimes, serious crimes. Those folks need to be deported immediately.
So I heard Kevin McCarthy, the majority leader of the House, on television today. And I want to direct this to Kevin, see what he thinks. So he was obviously on this issue, Dale, on immigration, trying to lay a pathway where he thought some of what the Republicans had already talked about and passed could be meshed, fused, in a way that would be acceptable to a lot of what Trump said on the campaign trail. He talked about a subset of illegal immigrants, just to what Brian said, who should be looked at first and deported if they are doing illegal things, different than getting here illegally. And then seemed to be this, we'll kick down the road, we'll secure the borders, although an interesting, maybe not always a physical wall, maybe sometimes a virtual wall. And then once that's done, take a breather and see about what we do with the remaining people who are here illegally. So Kevin, give me your view of how you think that might play out on the Hill.
Well, it's a classic case of rhetoric meeting reality. The rhetoric of building a wall and having Mexico pay for it it makes for great campaign poetry at a time where people are very anxious about an issue like that. But then the reality is that there are a number of folks up on Capitol Hill who believe that the enforcement is important, but there also has to be a modernization of the entire immigration system, and one that's consistent with American values of encouraging people that want to be part of the American dream and want to be part of a growing economy. And the reality is also that there are a number of immigrants that you need in order to support the American economy. So I think the folks that have been working up on this issue, I've been working on this issue on Capitol Hill for a long time, are very, very cognizant of that reality. And I think that those voices will also be heard inside any policy discussion about immigration. But the one thing that I think has changed is that there were many folks inside the Republican Party, like myself, who believe that defining our party on the issue of immigration only by what we're against and who we're against, and not what we're for and how it's consistent with a more aspirational vision for the country, that the electoral judgment that we received in 2012 and our inability to sort of win favor with a growing part of the American population, that didn't happen this time. I think those who were defining the party by what they were against and who they wanted to stop were rewarded. And that is very apparent to a lot of legislators. So, that is going to be, I think, right now is what conditions a lot of what they say and a lot of what they do up on the issue.
So my name is Nana Praku. I am a junior at the Stern School of Business. I'm studying abroad here in business and fashion.
That's NYU's Stern School of Business, just so I get the marketing down.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So recently, and more acutely after Trump was announced as the president-elect, there has been a rise in reported hate crimes against minorities. A particular instance that many NYU students can relate to is when the word Trump was written on the door of a Muslim prayer room at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. So bear with me because I have more than one question. What qualities as a president or simply as a leader does Donald Trump possess to heal the cultural divide that he was complicit in creating? More importantly, how do minorities such as the disabled, Black, Latino, Muslim, and LGBT communities who were all insulted or censured by Donald Trump during his campaign move forward in the Trump America? More importantly, how do these communities maintain their pride and identities without inciting a race war against an increasingly violent and fascist populace now emboldened to be vocal about their hatred or dissatisfaction towards the other?
I think that's more than a yes or no. And perhaps the crucible of the question is we have a very divided nation. How does the new leader of this nation and what first steps does he take to bind, as he said, bind the wounds and try to move forward? Are there prospects, suggestions? How about let's look there. There's suggestions of how that might be done and go about to remove some of that skepticism bordering on fear?
He could say he's sorry. I mean, seriously,
Look,
that's not a joke.
Look, there's running for president and then there's being president. And one of the things that's unique, and look, I am a President Trump critic up here. I did not vote for the man. I would never vote for the man. But the presidency, I have deep respect for. And what's unique about the presidency is that it is a unifying office. It should be a unifying position. And the role of the healer-in-chief, the role of the leader of the American family, I think, is really important. And I can only hope, and maybe there is some sort of built-in accountability of the American people that we can do more than hope. We can impress upon our leaders and this president that about that unique nature, and that taking the office and putting his hand on the Bible and taking that oath will change him. And so I have as a deep faith in sort of redemption. This is, I think, a very tall task to ask, but hopefully that could happen.
So just to be clear, I don't work for President-elect Trump, but I did support him and do support him, and I'm sorry that the rhetoric was so heated that so many people felt and feel deeply frustrated and scared and offended. And certainly I know Kevin and I are both Republicans. There's other Republicans in the room, and we would hope that the Republican Party would be seen as a party of opportunity and inclusion. And I believe that President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence will attempt to do that. And finally, I would just say on the policy front, hopefully they bring about the types of policies that are inclusive and that promote and provide opportunity for all people, regardless of color, race, origin, anything like that, to succeed and to be their best. And I hope that that's the kind of president he will be.
If I could just build on what I blurted out before anybody had a chance, that he should apologize. I do think that he has to do something and not wait on this. It's not going to go away anytime soon. This wasn't just heated debate. This was extremely divisive language from someone who, at that point, could potentially be president. Now he is president-elect, so he has to take responsibility for what he said. He can do that symbolically by inviting people in to talk to him, to have a role in setting their agenda. He can do that by how he staffs his White House. He hasn't done such a great job of that so far. He could do that by calling the Khan family, the Gold Star family that he insulted. I mean, never in our history as a president or a soon-to-be president ever insulted a Gold Star family who paid the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Symbolic acts like that, I think, would go a very long way.
Your name's Donna, right? Nana, thank you for your question. And well thought out and put together than what I had scribbled here in my notes to try to say before this conversation was over, and that is pondering the question of what role and responsibility does President-elect Trump have to allay the fears of millions of people who are justifiably afraid of what his presidency means for them. It wasn't just heated rhetoric alone that is fueling the fear. Muslims are afraid because he proposed a ban on Muslims from entering the United States, and it was up in the air as to whether that applied to American-born Muslims. Gays and lesbians are afraid because at one point he talked about being ambivalent about marriage equality and support for so-called religious freedom bills, which basically gives people the permission to discriminate under the cover of so-called religious freedom. Immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are afraid, including their American-born children, because now they don't know whether President-elect Trump will indeed go through with deporting 11 million people, including their American-born children, which is, like many things that he's proposed, unconstitutional, but also immoral and goes against the character of our country. I think that President-elect Trump has a moral responsibility to leave aside meeting with people once he's officially president of the United States. The number one thing he could do right now is listen to the voices of millions of people on the streets spontaneously in several American cities around the country who are demonstrating against him. I think he needs to listen to what they have to say. He doesn't have to agree with them, but he does have to listen to what they're saying, listen to what their fears are, and do everything possible to be what Kevin, I think, rightly said is the role of the President of the United States, and that is, after a divisive campaign, to be the healer in chief, and not just in words, but in deeds. And right now, the announcement that Steve Bannon is his senior counselor does not do that. Joel talked about one of the things that Breitbart has done, which Steve Bannon owns and runs. But Steve Bannon has a long history of things that only amplifies the fear and concern of our fellow American citizens who are afraid of what's to come. And so I think we need to spend as much time talking about how Donald Trump became president-elect of the United States. We need to talk about the forces that have been, I don't want to say unleashed, they've always been there. We know they've always been there, but now they've been given license to act on whatever animus they might have in their hearts. And if my inbox is any indication, then I think we are in for a much harder road than I think we've ever been down, because the people who have animus and hatred in their hearts now have feel that they have a president of the United States who has their back.
I think we have time for one more question. I think your hand was up before. Yes, purple sweater. Good.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Angela Carl. I'm a recent graduate, actually, of NYU, so it's great to be back here in NYU Florence. And thank you all so much for coming. We all really appreciate your time. My question is also about the divisiveness in America right now, but in a slightly different way. A lot of the podcasts that I've been listening to and a lot of the articles that I've been reading are saying that, that people who voted for Clinton or who are against Trump are essentially in their own bubble, that the media is in their own bubble. But speaking from personal experience, my county in Tennessee overwhelmingly voted for Trump, over 80% of people. But I am also very surprised by their vote, and I have a dialogue with them almost every day. So one of the things that I've seen, both on my Facebook feed and in real life, is that both sides seem to have a different opinion of facts. And for example, one thing that's been shared a lot on my Facebook recently is that Hillary Clinton did not win the popular vote because votes from abroad were not counted. And so I kindly just pointed people to the .gov site where it shows that they are counted. but my comment has like just been deleted or not responded to. So my question is, how do we forge a constructive dialogue with people who seem to have a different understanding of just facts?
Joel is chomping at the bit,
So there's a well-known senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once said during a debate to someone, "You're entitled to your own opinions, sir, but not your own facts." And I think one of the challenges the media faces going forward is to not rely on fact checkers who are on page 19 of your newspaper, but to do it every day in your reporting. That if someone is dissembling, if someone is lying, to call them out on it right at the top. That would be one thing that I think the media, because the media environment has changed, has to get more aggressive about. But to your other question, yes, we're all up here talking about the divisions in our country, but their patterns defy logic sometimes. Hillary Clinton lost Texas by about 9 points. She lost Georgia by about 6 points. Texas's biggest trading partner, by the way, is Mexico, and I suspect that that delegation will resist very forcefully any attempt to kill NAFTA, because they had the fastest growing economy, by the way, during the last 8 years of any state. But I think those things tell you not just that we're divided, but there are people across this country in different places who are not as predictable as we think we are. Some of them we think are going to be on one side aren't, and some of whom we think are on the other side aren't going to land there either. I believe this country is stronger than any one person. I believe this country has better days ahead of it. I completely have rejected Donald Trump's dystopic vision of this country. We are the greatest country on earth. We will be. Our military is not a disaster. Our people are not stupid. They are smart, they are caring, they are inclusive, and if he can live up to that, I think that will surprise a lot of people, but if he can't, it will be a disappointment and a tragedy for this country. And that's, I think, the fear of so many people, including the questions we have about people who've been alienated. And I want to say one other thing, if I can go back to the last question. I think this is more than apologizing. I think a president has to show, not tell. And I think particularly after the campaign we saw, there is an extraordinary burden on Donald Trump to show repeatedly, over and over again, something different than what he sowed and what he cultivated in this campaign. And I share Jonathan's concern about the appointment of Mr. Bannon to a high-level White House post, and encourage folks to look at Breitbart on a daily basis to see what that means, because that was the first place he could have showed something different and said, "Steve, you were great in the campaign. You're a friend. I can't put you in the White House if I'm going to bring this country together."
Thank you. And I think that's the last question we have time for. I want to thank the panelists. I think they did approach their job with humor and grace. And just take the moderator's prerogative for a final word, especially with the last two questions from the students. It is certainly appropriate and to hold our leaders now to high standards that we expect in terms of being a unifying force through words and actions, perhaps. But I would also throw out to the students a challenge that this is a time for you, that you also should step up to the plate and find ways and find channels and find organizations to belong to, and find ways, if you're concerned or worried, that you help a countervailing force to also be sources of both compassion and activism, if that's what you feel called for. So I leave you with that message, and we go to lunch, and then we come back for a panel after that. Thank you. Well done.